Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far. I want to thank everyone who has been viewing, liking, and giving me their time. Taking their time out to actually just watch little old me. So as I discussed in a previous video I did a couple of weeks ago on Darryl Rowe, I am going to be doing some cases concerning things that have happened within my community, so the LGBTQIA+. And while the victims in this story today are mainly heterosexual men or straight men, the perpetrator was a member of my community. Now, obviously, with his religious upbringing, he wasn't able to be the person he wanted to be around his family, and I believe, obviously, as we know, in certain countries, it's still highly illegal for people like myself to exist. In certain countries, it's even a death sentence, which does really surprise me, that the fact that this sort of thing still goes on in 2023. But it's, who am I to judge someone else's country? Do you know? But anyway, so without further ado, we are going to be discussing the case of Reynhard Sinaga. And this is actually a case that I've only recently come across. Even though the news came out only a couple of years ago, didn't actually hear about this at the time. And there was apparently a program about him a couple of years ago as well, but again, I never came across it. So I just spilled a bit of tea on my finger. So who was Reynhard Sinaga? So Reynhard was born on the 19th of February in 1983, and he grew up in a town called Jambi on the island of Sumatra, which is in Indonesia. He grew up with his father, Saban, or Saban. I'm not too sure how to pronounce that name, so if anyone can leave a comment and just obviously correct me on the pronunciation, that would be appreciated. He also grew up with his mother, Normawati, and 3 other siblings. So they raised their son in a strict Catholic upbringing, which, from the bat, it just tells you everything you need to know about the belief system that we're going to sort of talk about later on, with comments made by his parents, mainly his mother. His father was also... So the family, were very well off, very rich, very educated people. I believe his father was a banker. I can't find any sort of information on what his mother was actually doing for work. But obviously, as a banker, you're raking it in. In fact, I know. Obviously, as discussed in another video that I just recently did last week, I work in a pub at the moment, and one of my punters that comes in, he's a banker, and he's very, very well off. So I know that these people just have money lying around, so it can afford them the best life that myself or yourself we could only dream of. So Sinaga, very, very educated, very smart man. He actually started university in the mid-2000s, and he gained a degree in architecture in 2006, and then a year later he acquired a student visa to come to study in the UK. And he settled life in Manchester, going to Manchester University, and he completed a Master of Science in Urban Planning in 2009. And he then went on to acquire a Master of Arts in Sociology in 2011. And in 2012, he studied for a PhD in the University of Leeds. For this one, he didn't actually complete. He was actually still studying for this where at the time of his arrest. But he wrote a thesis which actually failed, and the thesis was called Sexuality and the Everyday Transnationalism Among South Asian Gay and Bisexual Men in Manchester. And obviously, as I said, this failed, and he was still actually in the process of rewriting the theses at the time of his arrest. Throughout this whole time of him being a student at Manchester University and the University of Leeds, he was financially supported by his father. So obviously, like I said, his father would, his whole family were very, very well off. So, during his time in the UK, Sinaga was able to live his life as the open gay man that he wanted to be. Obviously, in our country, in the UK, if you are watching in the UK, obviously our laws changed surrounding the LGBT community in 1967. It actually got decriminalised. And later on, by a long stretch of imagination, it's still got a little way to go in regards of certain people's attitudes. But, I've noticed a massive difference from when I was growing up. Obviously, as I was discussing in, going back to the Darryl Rowe video, discussing my time growing up, I grew up in sort of at the height of the AIDS pandemic, so I had that sort of stigma attached to me being gay, and going to school at the very, very tail end of Section 28. So obviously back then wasn't easy for me, and obviously it must have been a hell of a lot more difficult for Sinaga. Not that I'm feeling sorry for him at any stretch of the imagination. What we're going to discuss is about as reprehensible as it goes, but I can't imagine having his sort of childhood growing up in a country like Indonesia, where it's predominantly a very religious country, and we all know religion and their views on homosexuality. So obviously, when his parents were visiting the UK to come see him, he was having to obviously hide the fact that he was gay, and obviously vice versa when he was flying back over to Indonesia to see them. But in the other times, obviously he was able to be himself. Sinaga moved into a flat on Princes Street in Manchester. Obviously I've never been, but I do know that looking at Google Maps, the flat is sort of Prince's Road, rather, sorry. It's right in the hotspot and the hub of all the nightlife that is surrounding the area. So very local to a lot of nightclubs, a lot of bars. So it's very easy to go out and pick people up if, that's your kind of thing, or, if you go out and get drunk, you haven't really got that far to toddle off home. And obviously this was the perfect sort of place for Sinaga to, associate himself with his victims. So people who knew him described him as 5'7", unassuming, slim man, and his social media presence only showed the face he wanted others to see. Sinaga's persona of unassuming allowed him to carry out the rapes and sexual assaults. Police believed it to be in excess of 200 men that he had actually assaulted. That was between 2015 and his arrest in 2017. So, obviously, you can look at that and, being described as unassuming, you've, just sort of like the everyday person you'll see down the street that, you're not, because I always say, think with, like, go with your heart. So, what does your heart tell you? And if your heart's telling you that that person is a bit dodgy, you tend to move away from them. If you're sort of unassuming, you don't take that necessary precautions, and you don't look at them and think, oh, this person's gonna do me harm. However, others who knew Sinaga, so I know his flatmate did speak out about him as well, or former flatmate, should I say. They believed that Sinaga's privileged upbringing had given him a very self-righteous attitude. Sinaga himself being heard to have said that if he had died, the world would stop spinning. Like just because his family are rich and whatnot, and he had this amazing privileged upbringing, he could buy anything he wanted and whatnot, that the world owed him a massive favour just for the existence of him being alive, which is, excuse my French, bollocks. So throughout his 2-year spree, Sinaga would often be seen walking the streets and waiting for his victims to be leaving the nightclubs. And he would then approach and lead them back on the pretense of offering them a safe place to sleep off the alcohol, call a taxi, call a family. But he would then be offering his victims a drink laced with GHB. And obviously, we all know what GHB is. I don't really need to go into those details, known as the day rape drug. It was actually used because obviously its effects of knocking you out. It was actually used for people with sleeping disorders, but obviously, as we all know, something that's made very positive always gets used for something very dark. We see that a lot of times in the world, and you only have to look at poppies, like the flowers, and then realise that obviously their seeds are made to use heroin. So something that's always there to help or appease always ends up being used for something dark, which is a sad state of affairs, but it's just obviously, unfortunately, the world we live in and the selfish people that live in it. So after obviously drinking the drink and falling asleep, Sinaga would then go on to carry out his attacks, and he would actually film the attacks as well, which is about as low as you can get, really, in my opinion. So apart from one occasion, it was proved that Sinaga had not been using condoms. And despite this, I mean, obviously, like I said earlier on, this was 200 victims, and only one of them he used a condom on. So despite this, he actually tested negative for all STIs, which is a goddamn miracle. And, thankfully for his victims, they didn't have to go through that extra ordeal after finding out. Obviously, the details afterwards, during the police investigation. So despite obviously all the evidence that was against him, Sinaga stated everything had been consensual, even though obviously the police, they could see that the victims were asleep, knocked out. Some of them were even heard to be snoring on the videos. So how you can sit there and say that it was all consensual? I mean, obviously I do understand that CNC exists, which is consensual non-consent. I understand that, you know, that's a kink, people like that kink. But when you've got that evidence sort of facing against you, how you consider and say that it was all consensual is it baffles me. So almost all of his victims were known to have been straight men, and that was with the exception of 3. And Sinaga had even set up a WhatsApp group entitled Super Ray Saves Straight Boys from Their Monster Girlfriends. And he stated that he saw turning straight men as a sport, and that his bedroom was a straight boy's sanctuary. It just sort of, you know, you look at that and you just think, how deluded are you? And, you know, don't get me wrong, I understand there are some straight men. I mean, obviously, you guys probably heard me talking about my experience. Again, going back to the double row one, you heard me talking about my experience, and, you know, I've had a few affairs with guys that were straight but had bi-curious tendencies, or were at least bisexual. They just weren't ready to come out. I understand that, but obviously there are a lot of men who know that they are straight. You know, it's only women that sexually satisfy them, and I believe obviously deep down I know that Sinaga, he probably thought that he would be able to get away with these crimes, because he probably knew that the amount of stigma that's attached to male rape, and that men are more likely to be less forthcoming, and especially knowing that they've been raped by a man, they're less likely to go out and actually report it. You know, they will just keep it bottled up, and eventually it will lead to something a lot worse. Thankfully, the men in this case did come forward. Well, most of the men anyway, but thankfully that happened, and Reynhard ended up where he belongs. Sorry, I digress. I keep going on to little tangents there. So on the 2nd of June 2017, Reynard's last known victim. He was an 18-year-old rugby union player. So obviously very muscular, very strong, and what I'm about to tell you, you'll realise that, yeah, Sinaga did not stand a chance against this man when he was conscious. So during his rape, he managed to fight off Reynard, and he actually beat him unconscious. Obviously, the photo you probably see in the thumbnail that I posted for this video with the stitches and the bruising, so that was the result of this rugby union guy this proverbial kicking the shit out of him, which, you know, Reynard 100% he deserved. He then, during obviously the scuffle, he then grabbed a phone that he believed was his, sort of laying on the bed, and I think during the police investigation, he discovered that the phone wasn't actually his, it was actually Reynard's. And the police were obviously curious about the contents of the phone, so they went to the hospital. Sorry to cut off there. Something that I forgot to mention, sorry. So the guy that beat up Reynard, he was actually arrested first. Police believe in this to obviously be a GBH rather, sorry. GBH attack or upon Reynhard. So obviously Reynhard was taken to hospital. This young lad was taken to the police cells and interviewed, and obviously that's when the police come across the phone. So obviously with the story that the boy was telling, the police wanted to access the phone and they took it to the hospital. Reynard was very uncooperative and he was actually giving out the wrong PIN code for the police to access and see what was on the phone. But obviously eventually he knew the game was up. He gave the correct PIN number and police were able to ascertain that the 18-year-old boy was telling the truth, that Reynard had in fact assaulted him. So at first Sinaga was charged with a single rape, and that was on the 18-year-old. However, during the routine search of Sinaga's home, they uncovered 3 terabytes of data, and they were basically a homemade sort of diary of Sinaga's attacks upon all his victims. Now, 70 of the men were not able to be identified, but obviously the police had to trace the victims that could be identified, thanks to Sinaga's sort of habit of keeping little mementos and keepsakes of his victims. So I believe obviously the police had to watch this footage and recognise any facial features, any tattoos and things like that, and sort of go from there. And obviously I believe a lot of the men that were contacted, they had no idea that this had been happening, that this had happened to them. You know, they'd gone around for 2 years, 1 year, a few months or whatever, not knowing what Reynard had done to them. So I really can't imagine these poor guys getting that news. So Norma Wati, she actually came to visit her son in the hospital, and she at first believed Sinaga's version of events, and she went on to say if she wondered if the 18-year-old had made up this story, so made up a false rape allegation to try and hide the fact of Sinaga's to hide up the fact of his assault on Sinaga, so to try and say that obviously Sinaga had provoked him and whatnot, which obviously ties in with her not knowing that Sinaga was gay, her believing that she had sort of classic family, and believing obviously Sinaga was straight. So Sinaga went on to have here 4 trials, and his first began on the 1st of June 2018, and that lasted until the 10th of July that year, and that covered the cases of 13 victims. The second began on April the 1st 2019, and that went on until the 7th of May 2019. It covered 12 victims. 16th of September to the 4th of October 2019, covering 10. And then throughout December 2019, the 4th trial covered 13 victims. So obviously the whole footage was shown to the court, obviously all the footage of the assaults. And Sinaga was seen to be smiling and looking really gleeful and joyful. The fact that he was enjoying this experience. I believe his mum, or his family, only attended one of the court cases. So during the trials, Sinaga's church, St. Chrysostom's, again, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I do apologise. But they provided him with character reference, but they, however, distanced themselves from him after, obviously, his convictions and his guilty verdict. Judge Suzanne Goddard stated, "It's almost beyond belief that someone could profess some Christian faith at the same time be committing such evil crimes." And I'm not going to say that all people of religion are, terrible people, but you only have to look through the ages and know that some awful, awful crimes have been committed in the name of religion. You look at uh, bombings, suicide attacks, and some very obviously famous, well-known cases have had the perpetrator saying that they did what they did in the name of God, in the name of their religion. So to say that as a judge, I think it's a bit stupid. I'm not going to lie, because, like I said, we know these things go on in religion, but that's not to say that obviously every religious person is like Sinaga or like Eunice Spry, people like that. So Sinaga went on to be convicted of 136 counts of rape, 14 counts of sexual assault, and one assault by penetration. And he was also convicted of 8 counts of attempted rape. Sinaga's defence said they couldn't offer any mitigating circumstances. He was then sentenced to 88 years concurrent life sentences. So obviously concurrent means he would just run one after the other. And he would have to serve a minimum of 30 years before he was eligible for parole. However, as the Judge Suzanne Goddard described him as a dangerous, deeply disturbed, perverted individual. He had no sense of reality and that he should never be released. She considered the whole life order, but because she described this as a borderline case, and obviously where no one had actually died, she wasn't able to pass on that whole life order. So she could only pass to 30 years. And she added that, "In my judgment, you are a dangerous, cunning and deceitful individual who will never be safe to be released, but that is a decision for the parole board a later date." In December 2020, the Court of Appeal found the sentence to be too lenient. So obviously they can, the Court of Appeal, they can always, go to the judge and just say, "Oh, like this one was too strong or this one was too lenient." They can actually intervene if they feel it is necessary, and obviously they believed that they had the right to step in and say, "Well, no, like 30 years is too short," and he actually received a new sentence of 40 years. So he's actually up for parole in 2060, so he will be 77 years old. And you can sort of argue at that point, at that point of his life, will he be a danger to society at 77 years old? That's down for you to decide, but at the end of the day, it's up to the parole board. If they believe him to still be a danger, there is a potential that Sinaga could see out the last days of his life in prison behind bars where he belongs. Sinaga's father, Saban, spoke out and said, "My son's got what he deserves. The punishment fits his crimes. We as a family accept this verdict, and I don't wish to discuss the case any further." His mother, she said that the family didn't believe that men could be gay. It's just absolutely absurd, okay, you might not necessarily agree with it, but you know it's a fact of life. There is a massive community out there that don't have the same belief system as you. So to sit there and say, oh, well, we don't believe that men can be gay, it's just absolute bullshit. And get your head out your ass, love. This stuff happens. Um, she went on to say that they are a good Christian family and he's still my baby. Sinaga claimed that many of the victims had mistaken him for a ladyboy or ladyboy. So, obviously, for those who are not familiar, ladyboy was a colloquial term that was used against transgender men in Thailand and places like that. I do believe sex tourism out there for trans people is really, really popular, but as I say, like the colloquial term a fair while ago was ladyboy. And it is a term that is still kind of used in today's society as a sort of a slur upon transgender people. Transgender people, sorry, who come from an Asian background, like Sinaga. So he's trying to use that as his defense, and but it's just that sort of shit isn't gonna wash. You know, it's quite, you only have to look at his medical records and whatnot to see that that's bullshit. I mean, we all know the ordeal and the process that transgender people have to go through just to transition. And I mean, obviously, I'm only speaking from what I understand in this country. It might be different in other countries, but there's a lot of red tape that you have to go through with therapists and things like that, and then obviously to get that put onto the medication that you need to take. So obviously there'll be no no record, of that happening in the UK, whether or not it was true or not. So Normati went on to describe that on one visit she had asked why he had filmed the attacks, and Sinaga had replied that he liked doing it as the videos were his own little documentary. And in 2021, the BBC actually released a documentary about Sinaga called Catching a Predator. And I missed this at the time. I watched it recently while I was doing my bits for this case. Very interesting read, come out in 2021, but it's still available online if you guys are interested and want to watch. And some obviously of Sinaga's victims, very brave young men, did come forward and speak out against him. Obviously, I can't find any information of what they actually went through. I can only find experts of them talking about their experiences. So the charity Safeline, it reported that there had been an increase in calls to its hotline for male sexual abuse survivors. Duncan Craig, the founder of Survivors in Manchester, which was actually supporting some of Sinaga's victims at the time. It stated that he had started a national conversation regarding men opening up about their own sexual abuse. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, she called out for an urgent review in whether more stringent controls are needed in obviously people being able to buy drugs such as GHB. And she noted that how easy it is for an order from China, and this basically where you can buy 5 litres of this stuff for, as it was, £300. And also obviously they can package it in the little plastic fish bowls that you get in sushi packs that contain soy sauce. They can put the drug inside that, so it's very easy to unassumingly drop it in someone's drink. It actually only takes like 1 milliliter to knock someone out. So you can imagine how much of that would be in 500 liters. You can imagine how many victims will suffer through that amount of GHB being deported all over the world. So overdosing is obviously really common in GHB, and the fact that none of Sinaga's victims had died, it was seen as good luck. And this actually came from the prosecutor, Ian Simpkins. And in a roundabout way, I think it's kind of true. It is really lucky that these guys, none of them had any sort of adverse effects to Sinaga and the GHB. And obviously, thankful that obviously none of them actually had any other effects apart from obviously the trauma of what they've actually gone through. The mayor of Depok, where Sinaga grew up, his name is Mohammed Idris. He actually ordered raids on the Indonesian LGBT community, and obviously, understandably, rightly so, this drew massive negative criticism from human rights activists. And they said that he was using Sinaga as an excuse to target the gay community. You can almost hear the added old saying, that God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. You can almost hear that just chanting out from those words. So yeah, that's just sort of like got my go up. The fact that, yes, you had a predatory gay man that was targeting straight men, but not every gay man is going to do the same thing. I know that some gay men do see it as sort of a challenge to try and turn straight boy. But in my experience personally, it's been the unassuming straight men that have come to me for a queer experience. So to actually sit there and tar one community with the same brush, it does get my goat up. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I was talking about earlier on. I was talking about religion and their religious countries and their views around LGBT and the fact that it's still a death sentence, and they're marginalising us and tarring us with the same brush. But in the same breath, I'm a strong believer that you can't just tar everyone with the same brush. I'm a very big supporter of preaching about Islam, and the fact that everyone always comments on them about being terrorists, but you can say the same about every Irish person in the IRA. It's just simply not true, and it's simply not true that every gay man is a predator, is coming after straight men, or in some cases people worry that we're coming after your children. Not all of us are. Small minority are, but as a small minority, we don't accept people like that in our community. I just want to point that out crystal clear. So obviously I can only talk about what facts I can find or in regards of Sinaga. Obviously a lot of men didn't come forward, and I can only believe that is due to the stigma of maybe they just don't want people to know that they were assaulted by a man or raped by a man, because they're worried that people are going to take the piss. But if anyone does come across this channel who had this happen to them, if you are a straight man, not that they're going to come across my channel, you know, if you do come across this channel and this has happened to you, trust and believe you've got nothing to be ashamed of. The only person who should be ashamed for their actions is Sinaga. As always, I want to dedicate this video to the victims of Sinaga and anyone who has been affected by cases that are very similar to this. In fact, like during doing my research and doing my studying for this case, it drew a lot of comparisons to the storyline on Coronation Street a few years ago. The character David, who was assaulted by, I can't remember the character's name, but anyway, it was a male rape storyline that Coronation Street did a few years ago, and the perpetrator was spiking his male victims with GHB, and I believe in some instances he was filming the attack. So, you know, doing my research is just sort of mirrored. This is just another case of life imitating art, really, or in this case, art imitating life. Because I believe, obviously, that Coronation Street storyline was after this story come out. This is Floyd, everyone. Say hello. He wants to come say hi. He's being a good boy. So yeah, as always, I just want to thank you guys for watching. Really appreciate the time that you've been given. And I will see you guys on next week for the next video.